Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ashima Sinha, co-chair of the IFA Online Events Committee. On behalf of the Online Events Committee and the IFA Young Scholars Reading Group, we are so glad to have you all with us today. Before we begin, just a few friendly reminders. Today's session will be recorded, and as with our past events, we plan to post that recording on our YouTube channel. This is a Zoom meeting, not a webinar, so please keep yourself muted unless you are speaking. Feel free to use the chat at any time to share resources, reflections, or any questions that you may have. We have English, Spanish, and Chinese interpretations available, so you can access it by selecting the interpretation icon at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. Coming to today's conversation, we are joined today by Mariel Gruppi and Silvia Di Izania, the organizers of the IFA Young Scholars Reading Group. Over the past few months, the young scholars have been deeply engaged with this book, Data Feminism, exploring its themes, critiques, and insights through a rich and thoughtful reading circle. In today's Fireside Book Chat, Mariel and Sylvia will be speaking in dialogue with the author, Lauren F. Klein, who co-authored this book, Data Feminism, with Catherine D. Ignacio. Data Feminism is an award winning work about power, data, and feminist research, asking us to rethink how data is produced, interpreted, and mobilized, and how feminist approaches can reshape knowledge and research practices. This event builds on the young scholars' discussions and opens the space for our wider IFA community to engage directly with the author, Lauren Klein. I would now like to transition and I'll hand things over to Mariel, who will start us off. So excited for this event. All the very best.
Thank you, Ashima. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, everyone who connected to this event. Thank you, Lauren, to be here to talk about her book with us. And also, thank you, Sylvia, for this work that we have done throughout the year. We were just talking about that we never thought we could finish the reading group path like this. It was at the beginning was like a dream, but when Lauren accepted to be at this event, it was like a dream coming true. And so it's a good thing to our reading group meeting as well, and also for IAFFE, the Young Scholars. So I want to introduce myself. I am Mario Gruppi. I am a PhD student in demography at the Center for Regional and Planning at the University of Minas Gerais in Brazil. I do research on LGBTQ plus populations. Most of those are on economics and demographics. And I am most interested in the data collection part of sexual orientation and gender identity. Also, we are here with Silvia Deuzani, who is a PhD candidate in economic and social sciences at the University of Teramo, in a joint program with the University of São Paulo, and she's also a member of the IAFFE Young Scholars Committee. And her work is based on the unpaid care work on the gender impacts of conditional cash transfer programs in Brazil and Italy. I would like to introduce a little bit of the Young Scholars Committee initiative so everyone get to know the work that we have done. It's not only about the reading group, it's about creating a base and support young scholars and early career researchers, and also PhDs, students, grad students in general, that we have inside the IAFFE organization. So there we have a lot of other initiatives like the mentorship. We have the reading group that we are talking about right now, and we have a lot of other activities. So if you are interested in know more about IAFFE, you're more than welcome to join the organization and be part of this committee, and also be engaging all the activities that we have. And about our reading group, we started our first monthly meeting in February this year, and we finished last month. Many of the IAFFE members joined the meeting this year, and in this, let's say, in this sample, we have participation of young scholars, senior scholars, practitioners and other people interested in discussing the topic of data science and feminism, and how we can, how data, feminism, and economics specifically, they overlap in our research, and not only research, but the work that we do in our daily lives. Like, we had a lot of people come from NGOs or other companies who are not specifically academic companies or organizations, but they were interested in this topic. And as you said at the beginning, we are here with Lauren Klein, who is one of the co-authors of Data Feminism book. Thank you, Lauren, to be here. We would like to know if you want to introduce yourself. You can introduce yourself, whatever you want, and then we'll start with the session of questions and answers about the book. The floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you also for everyone for putting this together and organizing it. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm really appreciating the introductions that I'm seeing in the chat. I love how global this group is. It's really a testament to how you've brought people together who all care about the same things. What are some things that you need to know about me? I am an academic. I'm a professor of data science and also English at Emory University, that's in the US South. Before coming to Emory, I worked at Georgia Tech, which is an engineering school, for a lot of years. Let's see, my own background is in a combination of computational approaches to cultural data, both historical and contemporary, and then also thinking about how theories from the humanities can be applied to inform data science practice. Although somewhat interestingly, I actually now, my data science department was founded by political methodologists, and we have a large concentration of economists, formal theorists, and political methodologists in my current department. And so while that was not really an area of work that I was exposed to in my own humanities training, it's now an environment that I'm very familiar with. So I appreciate all of you for being feminist economics. The world and the field needs more of you. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about relevant parts of my background later, but I think that's probably the bits about me that are relevant for this conversation now.
Thank you, Lauren, very much for your introduction, and thank you for being here today. Your book was very motivational, interesting, and I found it useful for my life, for my research, so thank you. I've prepared some notes so I don't forget anything important. And let's start with the opening section of your book, with the story of Christine Darden, that highlighted the importance of intersectionality and data. And as you and Catherine described, her story highlights the importance of intersectionality and data. As a Black woman, she faced discrimination on multiple fronts, not only from her male colleagues, but even from white women. And she was fully qualified, but she had to collect and present data just to get the institution to recognize her talent. And as you note in the book, the data basically backed up what she already knew from her lived experience. That women and men, even with the same qualification, publication, and performance, were being promoted at very different rates. And reading her story shows how important data can be, but it also makes me think of bigger question about intersectionality and about this tension in your book. So my question is, can you tell us more about the tension you described in the book, where marginalized people shouldn't need data to validate their lived experiences, yet they often need data to challenge fixed power structure efficiently? Can you tell us more about this?
Sure. So I think I just sort of honed in on one of the biggest issues and interventions of the book, which is to really push back against this idea that when you're providing one form of information, it means that you sort of can't provide other forms of information, or that one obviates the need for the other, or somehow delegitimizes the other. You know, one of the fundamental premises of feminist theory, and this comes from feminist science and technology studies and what people sometimes call feminist epistemologies, right? Sort of like how you see the world, is that we always learn more by bringing together multiple forms of knowledge and multiple forms of evidence. And the goal is always sort of a composite where you're looking at all of these different ways of knowing and bringing them together. And so, I mean, I think the danger is that when you're dealing with personal experience versus large scale data, or qualitative information versus quantitative information, that one is somehow valued more than the other, or one replaces the other, or someone says, well, because we don't have, because we don't have large scale data, the stories that I'm hearing don't count, right? And so I think one of the most important things to me, not just for the book, but in general, with respect to my research, which is very mixed methodsy, is that we're always looking at these forms of information or evidence together. And so I think that's the large scale takeaway. But the other thing that I'll say, and I think that it's important to be explicit about it, is like, it's important to recognize the audience that you are aiming to convince, or the minds you're hoping to change, or the conditions you're hoping to improve, or like whatever it is you're trying to do with your work. And depending on those audiences, it sometimes requires different ways of communicating the same information, right? When you are making a case to a decision maker in government, very often they want to see population level evidence, right? Not just, does this impact one person, but does this matter for my constituents? Does it matter for my country, right? And those are the places where I think you can scale up from what you already know to be true from having talked to, or having, like, being a person with the experience, right? To be like, okay, I know this is true. How can I amplify my own experience, or the experiences of people who I recognize need to have conditions change for them to be, in the case of Darden, rewarded, promoted, more highly compensated, or any particular issue. Sort of like deploying data strategically. And so that's the other thing. But then the thing that I'll say, just in the context of an economic setting, there's really valuable work that you can do in that field by insisting that there's a place for both, right? And so not only to include, and I actually do this a lot in my own scholarship, right, is that even when I'm writing for venues that want large scale data, or that want, like the most abstract version of the thing, like the model or the formalization, to always also include the other bits of evidence that contributed to that. So to say, like, here's the data, but here are some quotes from people, right? Or even the other way around, when you're writing for a qualitative audience that is most convinced by individual stories, how can you also say this isn't just one person, this is an entire group of people? And I think that's actually action that people can do who have both of these skills and recognize the value of both of these forms of evidence in a sort of, scholarly activist way, to try to change the default understanding of the sort of required evidence in order to prove the validity or legitimacy of the work.
Thank you, Lauren. I think I hope a lot of people who joined the meetings throughout the year are here today to listen to you talking about how we can challenge the default setting for methodology in economics, because we had a lot of meetings where we discussed, should we go through a more quantitative data, or more qualitative data in our research. And in the end, we came up with the idea that maybe the path is just in the middle, like mixed methods. Sometimes you have enough quantitative data to talk about important topic to your research, like feminist research in our case. but sometimes there's no data available. We can try to collect them in a large scale, but you can't. Sometimes you won't be successful. So you won't just not do the research. So, or are you going to try to find a more qualitative approach to the same topic that we're discussing? And I think they are complementary in the end. You can highlight some points in the quantitative perspective with qualitative methodologies and vice versa. So thank you for this comment. And also, we prepared more of like one main question to each chapter. So we are going to pass now to a more of the discussion of the matrix of domination, which in our meeting, we had a lot of discussions. We stayed like a lot of time discussing every domain of the matrix of domination, and we had a lot of questions to that. So in the question that we prepared for this part, I tried to acknowledge all the people that were a little bit curious about this topic. So if we think of the first chapter, where you talk about the Serena Williams case, where we have a lot of people after what happened with Serena Williams, which is basically she was pregnant and went through a lot of issues during her delivery and etc. And what happens was basically that a lot of Black women started to know that what they are going through was the same thing, but sometimes people just think that what's happening with their community, their population, or around the people around them are just like what happens with one. So when we have someone so popular and we get to know more about what happens to them, and we can be aware of something that's happening in our society that actually doesn't happen to every woman, but most of them, but most of Black women have been through some of the same issues that Serena have passed. We can think of the hegemonic perspective, hegemonic domain of the matrix of domination happens there, but also all the other perspectives as well. So in the book, it highlights the privilege hazard in this sense, which is basically the limitation that privileged people has in forcing harm in our society. Like if you are a privileged person, like white, male, cisgender, heterosexual man, sometimes you are limited in how you can foresee harm to other people from marginalized groups. So in this case, we can consider the example of Joy Buolamwini. I'm sorry if I misspelled the last name, but it's the case about finding the facial analysis software couldn't see her dark-skinned face. So in practice, from your perspective, how can scholars cultivate an ongoing practice of accountability, reflexivity, and positional awareness, both at the methodological and institutional level, that helps uncover their own blind spots, especially when you are talking from your perspective, like you're a professor at some important university at the US. How can we consider that in our daily work?
Sure. I think in many ways, there's a sort of easy answer to this, which is just like you just do it. You know, when you are working on a research subject that involves a certain group of people, then you just make sure that you have those people involved in the project, right? And I think, you know, I wish to sort of back up and say that, you know, that it isn't always the default position in academia to believe yourself, to sort of view that as a requirement of the work. And yet, if you decide for you that it is a requirement of the work, it's not that hard because every single project that you undertake, you ask yourself, you know, am I talking about an issue that I know about or that affects people unlike me? And if the latter, are people who are most affected included in the project in some way? And so that's a sort of an easy way to ensure that you are not overlooking perspectives with respect to the experiences that you are interested in researching. But to back up a little bit, I think to get to the point where you feel comfortable recognizing that you know, I say this, you know, I recognize we have people here who are um, students and junior scholars and faculty and people working in NGOs. You know, I say this as someone who has been all of those roles minus working in an NGO, but like you are trained in academia to cultivate expertise and authority. And in many ways, it can get harder the more senior you get to recognize, to sort of admit that you don't know everything you need to know in order to undertake the research. But one of the lines that I keep on coming back to from Patricia Hill Collins, which is not directly related to her matrix of domination, but is from Black feminist thought. She has a line in the book that says something like, there are very few pure victims and very few pure oppressors. And I've always found that very powerful for how it allows us to see that in almost there is no person who knows everything or who sort of has knowledge of every single subaltern perspective or every single dominant perspective. And even more nuanced than that, everyone comes to all experiences with some knowledge and some missing knowledge, right? And I think that that's a really generative framework. And I tell this to my students all the time. And I think it helps eliminate some of the fear or even some of the sense of sort of the ability to push back against this idea that you're being cultured or culturated in order to be the expert. You know, that it will never be true that a single person knows everything. And it will always be true that you need to learn something from someone else. And I think once you you adopt that mentality, it becomes a lot easier to recognize the gaps in your own knowledge and to make space in a very non-fraught or judgmental way to bring other people in. And we could talk in more detail. I mean, there's different levels of participation that you can imagine, right? From, you know, original research design to consultation to, you know, feedback. You know, there's all sort of different ways that make sense for different contexts. But I think that's you know, like very pragmatically, to me, that's something that I try to do in my work and think, you know, just ask that question always. And, you know, as someone who, for the most part, occupies mostly dominant positions, both as a professor, as a white person in the US, in the global North, you know, there's a lot of positions that I just don't know or have a lot of personal experience with, and that is okay. But just to sort of build that in as part of my practice. You know, in terms of the, you know, the matrix of domination more broadly, you know, one of the things that I think at a sort of formal or epistemological level that I think is really valuable about that framework as opposed to other sort of theorizations of power that you get from the social sciences and the quantitative social sciences in particular. This is sort of connected to my first point, is that what you gain from the matrix of domination, and I would say feminist theorizations of power more generally, is a place for personal experience in the explanation of how power works, right? You know, you can think about how other theorists say, you know, this is power, this is how I operationalize it. It's, you know, for example, the ability to make someone perform an action that they wouldn't otherwise do, right? Which is sort of like an abstracted idea of, you know, who the actor is and who the actant is outside of culture or context or specificity. Or you could even think in, you know, sort of some of the, you know, more canonical, you know, Marxist frameworks about like ideology even that say like this is how power works. You know, there's like some people at the top that are, you know, explicitly determining things, then everyone else is at the bottom, sort of, you know, internalizing the experiences of what has been pushed down from the top. But I think in a lot of those frameworks, there's not a place for personal experience or sort of social or even affective impact to be incorporated into the model as a legitimate input, right? And so I think there's sort of a two-part, there's sort of like the theory down and then the experience up way to view this. And one is like, of course you want the people because you will learn, you need them. But then from the top down, it's also to say, look, my belief of how power works in the world, the power that I want to study and the power that I want to change necessarily, formally involves a consideration of individual experience. And to sort of use that in order to also create openings for this firsthand experience, which may not be, like expert experience, right? But to legitimize its place in any explanation of how your mechanism or the phenomenon that you're studying or explaining, how that works. And I think, one of the interesting things to me is that I'm not sure at the moment that we wrote the book, I was thinking about how those pieces fit together. But now that I'm in this department of all these formal theorists who always come at things with like, this is this enormous big picture, fully abstracted view of how things work in the world. To me, it's like, oh, you can intervene at that level too by inserting additional, fundamental components of how things work in the world, right?
Yes, thank you, Lauren. I must say that I changed my framework from my PhD dissertation after reading your book, because it changed completely my view over the power structure on data collection on sexual orientation, sex, and gender. So just to say that's so insightful hearing you talking about the book as well. So thank you. Sylvia, do you want to move forward to the next question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Lauren. I'm actually adding a note on this because it's such an important point. I really appreciate your answer. When you were talking, it reminded me of something I experienced at the start of my PhD. When I started my PhD, I sometimes felt a certain pressure to align my research with more traditional economic perspectives, especially in contexts where feminist approaches are not yet considered central, like business economy. And reading your book, especially your idea of feminist killjoy, for example, or not, helped me understand how important it is to know to protect intellectual diversity and stay connected to my own question and motivation. And I also want to say that I've learned a lot from, for example, my mentors or colleagues, including those who work from more traditional viewpoints of economics. But your book made me reflect on how I want to behave in the future. For example, if I ever supervise someone, and I want to people to feel free to explore their own ideas, not only follow mine ideas. So thank you for that. And I would like to talk about how your book pushes back against the idea that, for example, reason and emotion are totally separate. That split is based on a long story of treating emotion as less serious, for example, or less valuable, because it's linked with females. And your book showed that knowledge is influenced by where we come from, what we feel, and how we experience the world. For example, a strong example, I think, is Periscopics stolen years, which you mentioned in the book. It uses emotion, loss, and embodiment to show the real human impact of structural violence, not just the numbers. So my question is, how can feminist data practice break down this false divide between reason and emotion, and how can they offer a different way of representing information, especially in situations where, for example, women's time, care work, and experiences of poverty are usually ignored or dismissed, are not real evidence in policymaking, for example? Thank you.
Sure. I love this question. And this is one I've been thinking about a lot recently in the health context, in the public health context, because I will say, when Catherine and I first wrote this book, I gave a presentation very early on that focused on this chapter and on visualization to the US CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. They have an internal visualization research group that thinks about how they should communicate public health data. And they got so angry with me. It was actually one of the most hostile responses that I received to this chapter, which I think most people broadly are like, oh, it makes sense that you should communicate, if there's something you care a lot about and you want to change people's minds, you should 100% use every single method available to you in your visual communication toolbox in order to do so. But the CDC people said to me, like, kind of, how dare you? They said, we work so hard to have the public believe in the legitimacy of our science that we cannot believe that you would suggest that we should use strategies that delegitimize the truth or validity of the research that we have done. And this was only maybe a couple of months after COVID. So 2020, 2021, something like that. And at the time, I thought they were right. I thought, you're right. I shouldn't be so hard on people who are really just trying to communicate the baseline amount of information to a either skeptical or uninformed public. But the thing is, 5 years later, we now have RFK Jr. as the head of public health in this country, who does not believe in science. The CDC has been fully gutted and undermined of any expertise. And so I've come back to this and I've been thinking, really the issue was actually, their failure is from every area. So I don't want to point fingers and only blame one person. But I do think about if at that moment the CDC had sort of heard the part of the chapter that was about recognizing that people respond to information and data affectively or with feelings, and trying to align the message, or sort of essentially like, what are the findings of the study, right? What did we find and how can we communicate that in ways but that are both show the data, show the evidence in a sort of stats-based framework, but also try to communicate the same findings through an emotional register. Like, would the CDC have been more effective in making people believe in public health rather than the do my own research kind of thing, which is essentially people who have not had their feelings legitimized ever, and in fact having their feelings dismissed, even though, as we were talking about earlier, there is always a grain of truth to any feeling, right? And so to me, I've really been thinking about how the more important thing is not even the binary between emotion, reason. Is one better? Should we elevate one, decrease the other? It's really the importance of recognizing that all of these ways of knowing are ways of knowing, and that the most important thing is honing in on what your research has found and then aligning the communication strategies with the findings. And the error is to misrepresent the findings, right? Is to use emotion to manipulate. But if you are using emotion to communicate or to reinforce or to sort of promote what has been learned through established, vetted scientific practices to people who are more likely to feel things rather than look at a bar chart and say, oh, I see myself and, my neurodivergent kid on that chart, like you need to be able to speak to all people. And so I think, it's made me sort of focus on sort of a different part of that setup. And I think, to be honest, I think I would frame things a little bit differently now, given that we've sort of arrived in a place, at least in a US context, where the weight, like there's sort of this politicized split between science and feelings, when the reality is that those things should not be aligned in the ways that they are, right? Both science and emotion can be used to advance any sort of political principles, right? And you shouldn't need to reject science in order to advance a viewpoint that you want, right? At the same time that you shouldn't need to reject emotion to be on the side of public health, So, I mean, it's it's nice to be able to think about these in an academic context. When I think about the reality of where we are in the day-to-day, it's very depressing. But I do think that's actually like a very interesting real world scenario that a lot of people could benefit from a feminist framework to think through.
Thank you, Lauren. I think a lot about when I started working at a foundation that I'm working right now. It's a little bit different when you want to communicate a result of an outcome from your research in an article to a journal or a PhD dissertation, and you want to put your results from an evaluation, for example, an evaluation from a policy, governmental policy, in a report, and you want to communicate those results to policymakers and people who are not academic. You want to address the results to people from NGOs. It was a little bit challenging for me at the beginning because I had to think about what do I want to communicate on that. And when we discussed this chapter in the reading group meetings, I was so impacted by the perspective of emotion and the more perspective on the rationality and emotional over communicating results. And also about you just said, like, it's not the binary, it's like one or the other. Maybe it's both. Maybe you need to acknowledge more what do you want to communicate in the end. Like, if you want to be, how do you want to be impactful? I think it's the main message from that. So important, so insightful. Thank you so much. I would like to recall a recent event that happened at LinkedIn last month about the people changing their gender marks on the profiles. When I saw that, I was like, oh my God, I need to comment on that on the reading group meeting or the Fireside Chat meeting, because it's so interesting how these let's say this event that happened over there, over the social media, of people trying to perform a different identity, like a dominant identity, if we could say, putting the gender as male, using the communication and the wording of the posts as like the men, most of men do, and seeing their performance inside the platform going up, like getting more views, getting more interactions, and things like that. So this tactic successfully bypasses the mediate algorithmic. Oh my God, some words are very difficult to speak when we are Portuguese native speakers. However, this strategy requires minoritized groups to perform a very hegemonical ideals that the bias algorithm promotes. So it was basically women and gender marginalized people performing dominant identities and seeing their performance inside the platform going up. But if we think about that, and given the ethical complexities around recounting and reclassifying gender inside a profile in a platform, particularly for trans and non-binary individuals who face the paradox of exposure, what do you think are the long-term dangers if economic success on these platforms is reserved for those who are willing or forced to perform the binary categories they seek to dismantle? Does this strategy ultimately reinforce the matrix of domination as that we were talking about, like hegemonic domain, or can this kind of hack still be considered a viable path towards justice? So do we need to perform the dominant identity or not? Or it's just some crazy thing that happened last month?
This example is another one. I'm so glad you brought it up because it's one of these examples where, I mean, I'm sure all of you have the same experience where as soon as someone said it, it was sort of like, oh, of course this is happening, right? We know all about why this is happening because it's just like, every other example of this, this exact same scenario, not in this particular context of LinkedIn. I mean, I will say, so a couple of things come to mind. So, like most broadly, what seems important is the framework that comes from a lot of decolonial approaches, which have to do with your relationship to any sort of system that eventually you're hoping to not have to work within, right? And this is sort of this three-part, like you always, like if you are in the system, you want to push back against the system. If you are outside the system, you want to, I guess if you're in the system, you want to work within the system to change it, right? If you're outside of the system, you want to push back against it. And then you also need people who are sort of imagining a world that is not connected or exists in relation to the system altogether. And you need all three of those things happening because we don't exist in a world where we can go from, if you are a job seeker, where you go from a person who is looking for a job very badly to a world in which you are fully employed with a livable wage in perpetuity, right? Like, so you need these different things happening at the same time. With respect to the question of sort of what does it do to perform the dominant identity? I mean, to me, I think you're right. It is very dangerous if all that happens is that a couple of people who are in the know and who are able and willing to change their gender marker say, it's all fine now because I switched my marker from man to woman or woman to man, right? It would work if there were a collective action and, a significant portion of LinkedIn users, everyone changed their gender marker to man at the same time to the point that the gender marker no longer becomes a meaningful signal, right? I like that approach. And I also think that at the same time, you need people calling out LinkedIn for having not recognized an algorithm that is reinforcing of these deeply embedded social and cultural biases, right? And I think, one of the reasons why the LinkedIn, I was looking in the chat about this, the question of whether or not it was just the gender marker or whether it had to do with the language and the rhetoric and the framing used by more male LinkedIn posters that made them more likely to get placed higher in the feed or whatever. Like, I do think that anytime you are dealing with any sort of algorithmic system that is using cultural data in order to make its decisions, you need to be very, very wary as to whether or not you are just reinforcing deeply embedded cultural norms, or whether you have truly designed an algorithm that is inclusive of multiple ways of not just knowing, but of self-presentation, right? And I'm just thinking there's so many examples of this, but one of the things that, like a couple of examples come to mind. So one, Catherine, my co-author, has been doing a lot of work on feminicide since writing Data Feminism, and she has worked with data activists to design some essentially like sort of classifiers that will allow them to surface cases of feminicide that they can then evaluate themselves to see whether or not it is sort of instance of feminicide that should enter into their data, or whether it's a sort of a false, whether it's the news report is talking about something else. And one of the things that's always been interesting to me, sort of like in talking to Catherine about her research, coming at things from the perspective of someone who spent a long time studying language and textual data, is that she recognized, for example, that the classifier performed differently. It had different accuracy measures on different types of feminicide reports. So it performed well on feminicides of white women. It performed less well on feminicide reports of Black women. Same thing for Indigenous women and other cases in which the framing, the rhetoric around the reason why a woman was killed, if you are white, it rarely takes into account other cultural or social or group level dynamics. But if you are Black or Indigenous, that's always part of the story, right? And so at the level of a word-based classifier, so this is like a logistic regression-based classifier where you can see there's like a coefficient associated with the top words that are more strongly correlated with like, yes, feminicide, no, not feminicide, right? Like at the level of language, some sort of measure is determined by who the people are who are being discussed in the language, in the document, right? And so if you're just like, oh, I'm looking at some measures and I'm gonna like, this seems to be saying that this is definitely in the case of a feminicide, like a case of feminicide, or this is definitely like a post that people are gonna like. Those measures are not neutral, even though they're numbers, right? They're coming from data that is influenced by culture. And so anytime you are dealing with data, which is pretty much like all data, right? But especially textual data or human data, right? You always need to be inserting this layer into your evaluation that's saying, like, what is the signal that I have surfaced? Is this like, a true authoritative indicator that this thing is what I'm saying it is? Or is it an indicator of something else? And again, like the fact that Catherine's classifiers performed differently on different types of instances of feminicide was a finding, right? It is fascinating and tells us something, tells us a lot of things, but it's not necessarily the sort of like universal measure of yes, no that we thought it was in the beginning. And so I think, in the LinkedIn case, probably what their like, post rank algorithm was saying is like, is this post sort of some sort of combination of lexical and visual framing that adheres to sort of the dominant way in which professional success is measured, right? Which of course is correlated with people who are most recognized for their professional success, who are white, well-educated men, Western, weird, white, uh, wait, help me with the weird acronym. White, educated, what's the I? Uh, Anyway, you can Google.
I don't remember that.
It's a really helpful acronym, but the acronym is weird. But I always forget the letters in the middle, right? But essentially it's an acronym for sort of the qualities of what gives someone elite status, right? But anyway, so like that in effect is what LinkedIn has found in their post ranking algorithm, right? It's like they've successfully trained their algorithm on the demographic features of who is rewarded professionally globally in the world, right? But they have not successfully trained their classifier or their sort of page ranking algorithm on the other people who are also very much successful, but who are not recognized in the most dominant way for it, right? And I know this is a little bit of a ramble, but I think this example is really interesting. Here is where I find the work of someone like Wendy Chun really helpful, who does a lot of work around critical algorithms. And she has often said, we're looking at the output of ranking systems all wrong, right? What about like we should recognize them for what they are, which is a distillation of the things that right now in the world as it is configured right now, the things that are determined to be more important or more worthy of praise or success or whatever. We do not view it as an example of how we might want to then alter the system which rewards only those types of success or visibility or whatever. and use the output of these algorithms to change things going forward, right? And so she's like, what if we looked at most algorithmic decision making more like we view climate change models, which are very much used in this way, right? You model the present to say, we don't want the future that will happen if the Earth's temperature increases by 4 degrees, right? That's what will happen if we do nothing. The point of looking at the output now is to change our actions so that we don't have that future. And so, LinkedIn could potentially say like, hey, there's a real problem because only certain types of professional success are rewarded. We want to make sure that all forms of professional success are rewarded. What might others be, right? And this is also potentially connected to, like early critiques of resume screening filters, right? Which were heavily balanced towards male applicants at technical companies to the detriment of women applicants, where non-binary folks were not even measured at all, and like a lot of those systems were scrapped because they're like, oh no, they're biased. They're only surfacing the male applicants. But what if you said like, okay, well, let's fix it, so that we are more sort of like equitable outcomes, right? Because we do want a more diverse workforce, right? Those models can be instructive, but just not in the ways that we think. Oh, and thank you for the people who have looked up the weird acronym. The I is industrialized. Okay, amazing. Okay, thank you. I will know that for the future.
Yes, thank you, Lauren. Sylvia, do you want to
Yeah.
jump?
Thank you, Lauren. That part really resonated with me. What you said about measures not being neutral, even when they look like numbers, is so important. And my first formation was anthropology, and I really connect with this idea that data always carries culture, narrative, and power inside it. I see this all the time, categories that look objective, clean, or universal, and different depending on who is being talked about, how the story is framed, and which social dynamics are present, for example. When you were talking, I was also thinking about how these dynamics appear in other spaces, for example, like urban space or business and politics. Women who speak with a lower, male-coded, for example, voices. This is so-called male energy voice, for example, and are often perceived as more powerful. Why? More competent, more worthy, and more worthy of respect, for example. And in my own research on urban space, like urban anthropology, I see, for example, similar patterns in the structure of the city. Urban planning and architecture often reflect masculine norms, mobility system that don't account for care-related trips, cities where women have to travel around and around to manage care responsibilities, public spaces that can be hostile or unsafe for us and for every mothers, for example. Architectural forms coded as more masculine are often perceived as more legitimated or more prestigious, while everyday spaces connected to care, social, reproduction, and community work are devalued or made invisible. Thank you for raising our awareness about how the system like platform or social media reproduces this preference and the structure of power. I would like to comment a little bit about one of our reading group discussion. At some point in our reading path, we talk about how data science often celebrate the unicorn, wizard, ninja myth, framing data work as an isolated purely technical pursuit and sidelining local, experiential, and community knowledge. We also noted how many data for good projects, as mentioned in the book, end up reproducing charity logics, whereas data for collaboration demands shared leadership, accountability, and genuine community direction. At the same time, we reflect on how AI, present themselves as neutral and self-generated, masking the social, political, and historical decision embedded in their dataset and design, like, for example, male, cisgender men, white men, for example. So my question, given that number never speak for themselves, and that raw data is an oxymoron, because all data are shaped by social and historical contexts. How can we build data practices where context is treated as essential, and how can we be more collaborative and have more community-led approaches? Can you share more of your thoughts about this with our audience today?
Sure. Yeah, this is another really good question. And I think, it's one of these things where in some ways there's an easy answer, which is like you just do it, right? And if enough people do it and it becomes normalized, then that will be, that will be more recognized for the value that it provides. But that's easier said than done. And so I do want to offer a little bit of nuance to that response. With respect to context, I think that this is in some ways an easier area to tackle because the value of additional context is always so clear. Like you never don't learn more when you provide more context about the data or the analysis or the chart or who you talked to or how you talk to them. And it's to anyone who wants to believe in the trustworthiness of the work, that context to me is so clearly, evidently contributing more knowledge. And so I think that is just, obviously there's different scales and spaces for which you have ample opportunity to introduce as much context as you want versus places where you might just only be able, because of disciplinary conventions or space considerations or attention or, the template of the PowerPoint or whatever, you can only insert a little bit. But I think for me, with respect to context, that has been, that to me, is an easy one. I think I guess one of the other things about AI in a way is that these AI technologies are so context dependent. And the fact that there is such a divide between the people who are saying this sentient artificial power can make expert decisions in all areas, and the reality that literally every person who has interacted with an AI in any capacity immediately recognizes that the AI is missing something, right? In many ways, I actually feel like the people are open to more understanding about context of data than I think ever before, right? And so in many ways, the awfulness of AI, I think, has created an opportunity in that people are wanting to understand why these systems fail so frequently. And the answer is, well, all sorts of things having to do with context, right? With respect to participation, I think this is trickier only because the ideal version of a fully participatory project so rarely aligns with the constraints of any individual's workplace or academic responsibilities, right? Whether it's, this report needs to be sent up to my boss in a month, or the fieldwork was conducted by an external partner who we're no longer in conversation with, and all I have is the data. Or, in an academic context, I need to get tenured, I need to get a job, there is almost always a vast chasm between what you ideally would do in a world of infinite time and resources and what you can do. But I think in those contexts, again, sort of recognizing that and being honest with yourself, and also saying like, well, what can I do under the conditions that I currently am in? And recognizing also it might be different, it's different for every situation that you might encounter. What you decide in one context for one project may be more or less participatory than what you could do in another project. And I think holding out the goal of sort of horizontal, mutually informing, liberatory or co-liberatory participation as what you're always aiming towards, and then being truthful with yourself about what is possible under the constraints that you're operating with right now. I think that is a very pragmatic way to go through. And I will say that like one of the things that I feel that I have been that I feel like I'm doing a better job of after writing Data Feminism than I did before is if I sort of take a look at the different types of projects that I have undertaken for different audiences and different disciplines, and for different viewership, I think collectively I've been much more successful in enacting more participatory research models and authorship models than I was before, even by asking myself the questions of whether or not I could sort of expand the process to make room for, whether it's community data creation versus annotation, authorship involvement in terms of participants in the construction of the project itself, whether it's on the communication side, having different types of communicative forms for the different audiences who might be impacted by the work, asking for feedback, all sorts of these things. I'm not sure that I put as much pressure on myself to ask those questions, even if the answer was no, than I did before. And I think overall, it's led to sort of a more holistic view of things. And I say this as someone who, in the world of human-computer interaction, and even, areas of development economics that people are trying to do it well, there had been more of a conversation about participation than in my fields, which are historical. So oftentimes you're not dealing with people who are still alive, or you're dealing with cultural representations that were put out in the world by an artist or a creative, who didn't necessarily think that they would ever be people who academic would come back to and say like, well, what did you think about this thing? Or, I think that it's really thinking about everything being created by people and culture being an expression of people, has really opened my own practice up to these more participatory commitments. And I guess, again, like similar to the point about context, it's like almost never when you talk to people who are closer to the data or the work or the experience than you are, do you not learn something? That was a lot of negatives. But I mean, like, you like almost always learn something, and you very clearly have learned something when you talk to someone who knows more about this thing than you do, right? And so it's sort of a self-reinforcing system that I think you're like, oh, well, I talked to people, I learned something. It inflected the research in a way that I wouldn't personally have known about had I not talked to them. And then I think that reinforces the process moving forward.
Thank you, Lauren. I think we are getting close to the end of our specific time that we have set up at the beginning, like 1 hour, 15 minutes, but we have so much to talk about the book. And there's one question that I need to make, because I think it's one of the most important. Well, the whole book is like every chapter is important. I mean, everyone should read it. Working with data, working with feminist economics should read it and like really read it. But I want to mention about the hidden and undervalued labor in the field of data science that you mentioned on the 7th chapter. So the book details how much of data infrastructure relies on hidden and undervalued labor, like ghost work, emotional labor, outsourcing for platforms to keep working. So what kind of feminist action should become routine or have you seen become routine to ensure that the actual cost, like including social cost, planetary cost, as we have AI using a lot of data centers to process their technology. So how can we fully recognize that in the data science field, if we could say so? And just so we can wrap up the chapters of the book, and then we'll move on with the questions from the audience. So we'll have some people here in the audience making some questions. Then we'll move forward to this second part. So if you can make a comment on that, on the undervalued and middle labor, and how can we consider that in our work, it would be so, of course, it would be so insightful. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important question. And again, it's one of these situations where the conversation around AI has taken an issue that some people knew about and made it much more visible. And it's the exact same issue. I mean, it's in many cases the same companies both requesting this sort of devalued, undervalued, and exploitative labor for just sort of a new technology, and the same people providing it, in a slightly different technological context. And so I think it's really important at a macro level to remember that always, that these large-scale commercial systems are fundamentally dependent on people who are being harmed, so that we can use them for our research. And I think at the level of an individual research project, to ask yourself, like, is that required? Or are there other models or providers that you could use, whether it be, do you choose a model that has made a point of saying, we do not exploit people in order to do content moderation for this? Do you really need to use the quote state-of-the-art models, or can you use another one? In the case of annotation or transcription, it's like, can I pay someone a living wage to do this? Is that in the budget for my project? We all know for surveys, there are cheaper and less cheap online survey apparatuses, some of which have better labor practices than others. Like, can we use those? There's ways, both little, sort of small and large, that I think that we can have impact. But for 100%, I think, making these questions part of the design of the project, of the experiment, or of the research, is really, really important. I think on a small level, on an individual level, is something that we should all be doing. Because in many cases, and I've seen this, both as someone who asks for this and also on the side of people, someone who reviews like grant applications, and a lot. Like, if you get a budget rationale that says, I am choosing to use, for example, like Prolific rather than AMT for my survey, which, because it pays X number, this amount of dollars per hour, most people would grant that budget request if you're coming from a funder that is allocating funds, right? And I think at the point where you're like, I don't have enough, I'm not at the level where which my project is funded. I have a choice between, using AMT for more survey responses or using my personal networks for fewer. Like, you can really ask yourself, is this a project that requires that? Or would I make more ethical decisions at my own level in order to know that I have conducted this research in a way that is not contributing to the harm that is happening everywhere. I think in those particular decisions, we have a lot more agency than sort of academia has conditioned us to believe that we have, just because there are defaults that people don't question that are cheap. But those should not be the defaults.
Thank you, Lauren. I think it's one of the things and the topics that we shouldn't finish this event without comment on that. We have opened the floor to everyone who wanted to make a question. You can raise your hand, open your mic and your camera, introduce yourself, make a question to Lauren if you want to. But also we have some other questions that people have sent to us that we want to to ask you. And while people are here on the chat, sending the question to us and sharing their own questions. So I have one question here from Noelia, which is the co-chair of the Young Scholars Committee. It's not specific about the content of the book, but she was interested to know more about the writing process. So she asks, this is probably already part of the conversation, but I would love to know what motivated her to write the book and what the writing process was like. I think you mentioned part of it while like highlighting some points during your talk, but what about the writing processes and what motivated you and also Catherine to write this book?
Yeah, I mean, I think the motivation to write the book came from the times that we were living in, where there was just a constant barrage of examples and evidence of sexist, racist, biased data systems that were when it was so clear the reasons for those problems with them. And I think sort of coupled with the response that we had been seeing when there was a response, which was like, oh, we'll just, like debias the system, we'll fix it, post hoc. And that was also so clearly like not the solution that the fact that there were so many of these problems all coming from the same source required. And so I think we were writing from a place of sort of, I think, like righteous rage and conviction. And in some ways that made it really easy to get started with the work because it was so clear to both of us that there were things that needed to be said that had not yet been said at that point. And so I think that was sort of what motivated us to start writing, was that we sort of knew that, like, sort of identified the cause and were familiar with solutions that came to us from feminism. In terms of the process, it was neither of us had ever done anything really like this before. Very few people have ever co-authored a book together. And we just sort of figured it out as we went along. And I think, we did it all in Google Docs and we wrote it before the pandemic. So we used a lot of Skype, if you remember that. At a certain point we did switch to Zoom, but it was quite late in the process. And we just sort of had to feel our way through the establishment of structures that would allow us to get words out. And then as we learned what each other's strengths and weaknesses were, we could sort of, step in when we sort of knew we had come to a part where like the other was better at it than we were. So for example, we did initially we did just divide up the chapters. So each of us did the first pass on half of the chapters. And we did work together on outlines for those chapters. And if there was a point that one of us, if the person who was drafting the chapter hadn't included it in the outline, the other person would say like, oh, I really want to talk about this here. But then we did so much back and forth that by the end, it was not really clear, which words came from which person. But it's definitely true that there are certain things that I know Catherine is much better at than I am. For example, I hate a conclusion. Like, when I get to the end of the paper and I've said everything I need to say, like I cannot make my brain summon another way to say a thing that I've already said. It is the hardest thing for me to do, like ever. This has always been true, and it's true in every context. And so at a certain point I was like, oh, Catherine, like she can write a great conclusion. So I would just, get to the end of my chapter and say like, conclusion goes here. And then Catherine would come in and she would, much more easily than I could write a great conclusion, things like that. And I think, there were other things that went the other direction, but that is something that I am so appreciative of Catherine for her skill, because I just I can't, I never have, never will. And so there were ways that was super, super helpful. And I think also, just thinking in general about disciplinary jargon was really helpful. We have similar backgrounds and similar interests, but we're in pretty different fields. And so we were pretty attentive to trying not to use disciplinary words because of the audience we were writing for. But every once in a while, there'd be a term that like I would not think was a disciplinary word. I would think had a universal meaning, and Catherine would say like, "What? What is that?" And the same thing, like for her, right, where she would use a term that had a clear meaning in design or in HCI, and I'd be like, "I've never like that isn't a thing," you know. And so I think there were moments like that that were super helpful.
Marielle, you are muted.
I'm sorry, I was talking and I was just going to say that maybe we still have space for two more questions from the audience, if that's okay for you, Lauren, because we already reached the time that we have scheduled at first. But if you can answer two more questions from the audience.
Sure. Yeah. I probably
Nice.
have until like 12:30, then I do need to go.
Okay, nice.
Or I
So
guess 13 minutes from now for wherever you are in the world.
okay. We have Mohammed. If you want to ask your question, you have your hand raised, or I can read it if you prefer. I'm not sure if they're listening. Okay, I'm just going to make the question. Okay. Oh, Mohammed,
Yes,
do you want to
my
make
name
your
is.
question, please?
Yes. My question is that I just learned that word society as that statistically unusual on individualism, analytical thinking, and personal choice. If you work in a global team market, a product worldwide, or are trying to solve a global problem like climate change, what is one assumption? What is one assumption you make in your work that might be a assumption and that will be a non-perspective challenge you to consider it? I even dropped the question in a chat.
Yeah, I mean it's a really good question, and I think there's sort of two ways to answer it, and one is to say that, you know, obviously the asking me as someone who is for the most part one of these weird people, you know, Western, educated, industrial, now I can't remember the R, um, developed, you know, like I might not be the best person to give you a universal answer to that. Like you know, for me to give you an answer, I'd be like, well, I should talk to people who occupy the position that I do not have, right, and learn from them. But I will say, as someone who does do some work with people coming from different perspectives and places in the world, you know, one of the things that I constantly need to, you know, push back against is this idea that the goal is to solve the problem, right? That like there is a problem that it can be rendered tractable and we can find a solution and an intervention, and then at the end we will have solved it, right? Because that is this sort of, you know, uh, narrowly constrained, somewhat goal-oriented approach that I think comes to me from, you know, in more particular, sort of like almost like the framework of capitalism and sort of individualized success that the US really breeds in particular. And recognizing, I think, and this has happened more than once, that like the whole point is to sort of be there and to enrich the process and perhaps to extend or support what is an ongoing process of continually learning or changing or growing, you know, and that like it won't be a thing that has a start point and an end point, and you will come away saying, we came in with this problem and now we've come out with a solution. And that is a legitimate the it is a legitimate scope of research to say the project is going to be the process, right? Without these sort of definitive endpoints. And so that actually is something that I find myself a lot having to sort of push back, like, you know, check myself when I enter into a collaboration with people who are coming from a perspective that is not my own.
Thank you, Lauren. We have another question here on the chat from Else. She needed to drop off, but we are going to make her question. So it's being recorded and she can watch it later. The question is, how can the sources of AI models be re-engineered to include literature that critically questions the status quo, including critical feminist, decolonial, gender heterodox scholarships? What is the danger of AI recycling self-contaminating, dominant, non-feminist narratives, and how to avert that?
Yeah, I mean, so this is a really interesting question, right? And I think it's one that doesn't have a single answer. You know, fundamentally, the AI models that we are being told, and I would say like we being like both academics who are being told if you want to do state-of-the-art research, you must use this modeling approach, and then also people as citizens, especially in my case in the US, who are being told like these AI systems can make better decisions or more effective or efficient decisions than we could before. This particular class of models are ones that require, as we know, I'm just saying this out loud, but like huge amounts of training data that come from the internet that are optimized for the most likely outcome, which all converges upon language and perspectives that are the dominant ones, right? They're contemporary. They will not be feminist ones. They will not be non-Western ones. They will not be any of the things that the question asker described, right? And so is it possible to train models of that size that do not contain that information? Like TBD, right? We're seeing more in the context of sort of other languages, like non-English language models that are sort of trained in that language and not just transferring what they've learned to a different language context post hoc. We've seen this with historical language models that are taking data that stops at a certain time cutoff. And I guess there's a couple of examples of people saying we're going to use the same model architecture and just use different data, where the data will be smaller and therefore the models will be less fluent in their output because they just have fewer examples, right? So that's one thing to do. It's possible that those models will get better. Well, probable, right? So that's one possibility. Then there's also stuff that I'm actually pretty interested in, which has to do with some of the internal ways in which possible outputs are chosen or even are weighted, right? Like, right now it's just using softmax, right? Which like you all know, you're economists. So it like, picks the one that's like the most likely at the center. But what happens if the distribution curve is flatter and there's an intentional choice to choose things from a broader distribution? Would that change the output? Like similarly, you can sort of like move one layer up at the different neurons that now people are figuring out like at like a level of abstraction, like which kind of concept passes through which neuron. Is there a way to sort of say like, weight this neuron more, weight that one? Like that to me is like very nerdy and interesting to me. So that's sort of a way to potentially recalibrate an existing model. And then there's, again, it's just like, why do we need these big models if they're garbage for most things and uses and people, right? Shouldn't we reaffirm the value of smaller models that are not so greedy in terms of resources or environmental impact, that we can do better research with, right? And so again, these are sort of, there's a lot of different ways to do this. And there's not a single answer. I think we need all of them. But I think one thing that is clear is that we will never get a critical feminist perspective uniformly from a big large language model or corporate AI model unless we very intentionally engage with it. And so there need to be lots of different alternatives.
Yes, thank you, Lauren. I think this last part of your answer to that question is one of the main things that we should catch it and come back home and thinking about it. That's no such thing as something universal when we are talking about this topic right now. We are starting to understand how how data works, how it's collected, how are the influences of power over it, And yes, I agree with you on that. And I think it's more or less of the idea that you both put on the end of the book about data feminism being an unfinished process, that we are maybe we are we always need to come back to that and review and then start again, rethink again, and then restart our projects based on a more contemporary perspective to such topic. So now I think we have more of this idea to share with people. Today we have shared a lot of important ideas. A lot of people in the chats and message here saying that was really amazing. I really appreciate your time here with us today, talking about the book, talking about your ideas on data feminism. It's very important for us in the field of economics to do some research on that, to know more about data feminism, because we use a lot of data in our research, right? And as you both say on the book, on the conclusion, now let's multiply this perspective. Let's apply this perspective on our research, and maybe we can, in the future, we can meet a different environment for data where it's more empathic, where it's more conscious of the power structures, which is not happening today, but we should keep on that, right? I don't know if Sylvia wants to add something to that, but we are getting to the end.
Yeah. Only to thank you so much, Lauren, for being here today. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. Your questions, comments, and reflection have made this conversation incredible. One thing that really stayed with me throughout this discussion is how data feminism reminds us that data it's never just data. And thank you for teaching us with your book. It's an important book. I want to translate it in Italian. Maybe we can talk about this later, another day. There are some people interested about this from an association. The name is Period Think Tank from Italy. And maybe one day we can organize this because it's very important book, and I want to insert this book in every class of our universities because really it's very, very important. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks so much for having me and for staying and listening. And I look forward to crossing paths with all of you. If we see each other in the real world, please say hello. And otherwise, we'll hope to cross paths online again.
Yes. Thank you so much, Lauren. Thank you, everyone who joined this event today. That's it. We will share the recording with all the people that